I'm not here to speak over, for, or in place of Sheikh Hajj Haroon, but provide a platform for the writings of a brilliant man whose literary work has yet to see the light of day. While many of you may have known of or are familiar with his musical and spiritual endeavors, today's roundtable is to present on a forthcoming publication of his memoir, whose working title is The Man in the Mosaic. The work is a composition of 40 short stories and excerpts compiled by his esteemed student, Salim Andrew Magrodi, who you will all be hearing from as the final speaker of this panel, whoever. While not comprehensive of the massive archive and lived experience of the Sheikh, the 300-plus page work presents a collage of themes and aspects which Sheikh Haroon documented and reminisced on throughout his life. Each story, ranging from 2 to 20 pages, acts as a microcosm unto itself. A master storyteller, Sheikh Haroon, speaks to us from beyond, carrying us through his lived experience and pulling on threads throughout his life to show the way in which the mosaic of his life was woven into the cohesive fabric of the extraordinary man. Each of the panelists will present on a distinct facet of Sheikh Haroon, which Sheikh Haroon grapples with within his writing. I will provide a literary analysis linking Sheikh Hajj Haroon with a wider genre of Islamic travel writers. Zuri Bryant will provide an analysis of Sheikh's deep connection with the African-American experience, and Salim will conclude by discussing his personal relationship with the Sheikh and how Haroon's musical and spiritual legacy lives on. These papers and discussions are very much a work in progress, and we thank DISC, Dr. McLarney, and Julie Maxwell for this platform, the organizers including Professor Ernston Lowe, and all those who presented and are present today. We have been listening over the past 2 days, and we've already begun to incorporate and react to the brilliant and beautiful ideas you all have brought to the table. Now, to say Sheikh Haroon was just a travel writer would be too superficial. It would not provide us any texture on Haroon himself, nor produce any academically rigorous research, and worst of all, err on the side of the classic Orientalist tropes of a Westerner who experienced the East as an outsider. The goal of this paper, and the reason behind classifying Sheikh Haroon's writing as Islamic travel writing, is to challenge the modern conceptions of geographically aligned identity markers. I wish to also show that Sheikh Hajj Haroon's memoir emphasizes a modern mobility.
Sorry.
No, I thought that there was just a lot of people talking all of a sudden. Good to go?
Yes.
Okay. Modern mobility, which does not isolate any singular identity as currency, and instead produces a holistic sense of individual agency enabled through the framework of Islam. Central to my literary analysis, while simultaneously something I want to push against, is the framework of mobility theory, a social science technique developed over the past 2 decades to explore the way in which individuals, groups, ideas, and material culture create unique geographies which transcend historical and modern boundary systems as established by academia. The study's preoccupation with pre- and post-nation-state geographies finds its subjects in the margins, whether geographies in crisis, unique collections of identities, or within transgressive histories. However, as byproducts of its British origin and tendencies toward the rehabilitation of the radical subjects, mobility theory has often been a powerful agent in the recent framing of Islamic mobility in terms of violent jihadist movements and international terrorism. Simultaneously, world system theory, a framework originally of equally Western bent, however of economic focus, has been central in a counter-narrative, an exploration of the transcontinental mobility which Islam has historically not just facilitated, but promoted through both political diplomacy and religious pilgrimage. While leading scholars such as Abu Daoud have explored the inflection point of the 13th and 14th centuries through world system theory, their foundation provides a compelling model for further research on Islamic mobility into the modern world. It is from the synthesis of these 2 frameworks that I both use and seek to challenge the phrase identity as currency. Religious, racial, gender, sexuality, ability, and any other identity in combination becomes a system which equally confines and gives power to their holders. Social and professional relationships of certain types are closed and opened in frequency within each identity. However, the existence of these relationships at a microscopic scale within the macroscopic capitalist world system forces one identity into a conception of inherent production, marketability, and ultimately profitability. I need not tell any of those in attendance today the danger of associating identity with profit. The brilliant presenters before me have been exploring this very relationship in the context of the American South and the dangerous constructions which have been built to subjugate blackness in Islam. However, like those who spoke at this conference before me, to stop there would be to ignore the efforts of generations who have worked towards reparation, reconnection, and restoration. giving platform to the work of modern scholars, to the words and deeds of those who came before us, to the indigenous theoretical frameworks which have been overlooked for centuries, and to the incorporation of black Muslim writers into the greater canon of Islamic literature are each central to this continuous effort. As such, we must also address the fact that the framing of the study of mobility, particularly amongst Islamic polities, as an inherently modern subject studied by Western academics would be a fallacy. One need look no further than the 14th century North African scholar Ibn Khaldun and his seminal Muqaddimah for a codification of travel patterns of people and ideas. An even more robust literary tradition of Islamic travel writing has existed since the founding of the religion. A prototype of the traveler who moves along an equally physical and spiritual path can even be seen in the Prophet Muhammad himself. The authorship of these journeys is varied. Some, such as Sheikh Haroon, are autobiographical in nature, written on the author's personal experiences as memoir. Others fall into the category of sirah, the biographical study of important figures of Islamic history with historical and moral lessons. And finally, a genre of Islamic travel writing exists as pure parable, creating mythologic or fictitious narratives to take the reader on a journey whose commentary is coded by political and spiritual symbolism. Ibn Battuta's 14th century travels and Attar's 12th century epic poem, The Conference of the Birds, sit comfortably at either end of the spectrum as examples, providing critical, political, and spiritual commentary, respectively. Ibn Battuta ethnographically documents his travels across the Islamic empires and their vassal states, oscillating between a religious pilgrim and political emissary. For nearly 3 decades, he traversed the globe from the Atlantic to the Pacific, his ability to both ensure his stay in certain locales, while also continuously perpetuating his own travels, speaking to the level of agency Ibn Battuta not only held, but recognized and leveraged within himself. His transcontinental experience and oscillation between the center and periphery of various empires produces a text whose awareness of the vastness of human experience is only matched by Ibn Battuta's own self-assuredness amongst this variety. Whether intentional or not, a socio-political commentary is developed by the inherent scale of Ibn Battuta's documentation. Similarly, Attar's literary construction of seemingly disparate parables amongst the narrative of a collection of birds' journey to find Allah is gestalt. However, the mythic nature of this text produces a dissonant quality between the various chapters. Each provides a captivating snapshot and lesson, but the whiplash of the transition often leaves the reader seeking more from the chapters which have already passed and trying to create artificial continuity amongst the variety of content provided. The closing chapters refocus on the journey of the birds who ultimately find themselves to the reflection of the Godhead, Simurg, or 30 birds itself, fulfilling the composite nature not only of an individual and their spiritual experience, but the text itself. Attar reminds us that the whole is inherently greater than its parts. And disparate pieces, even those which remain inexplicable in the whole, work together towards a singular, beautiful end. With this framing in mind, we can now return to Sheikh Hajj Haroon and his memoir, a compilation of 40 recollections in roughly chronological order. They speak to his childhood, born and raised in Boston as John Masibo, to an a-religious black family during the Great Depression, collaboration with scholars in academia, experience and performance in the global jazz scene, and religious growth into the practice of Islam. Underlying these experiences is consciousness of his travel, and the idea of travel itself. Whether the Sheikh travels himself, he encounters someone who could be classified as a traveler as well. Or Haroon gives us pause to ponder the minute travels which we experience every day. The reader is faced with the immense network produced by this man in motion. Chapters such as The Flow of Barakah, which Salim gratefully already introduced, where Sheikh Haroon discusses the child encounters with the Somali Muslim Musa, or the moth circling the candle flame of the Kaaba, Hajj of 67, which details his pilgrimage in 1967 and subsequent grappling with his own identification, to the travel. They both center the act of travel and its inherent relationship with his own identity. Yet some of Sheikh Haroon's more subtle chapters bring out the mystical quality of the unremarkable journeys our lives are punctuated by. After days of discussing the violent, rapturous, and forced migrations of black Muslims, I'd like to highlight a duology of chapters in which Sheikh Haroon reflects on the commonplace travels through his time in New York City, especially during the night. Night Creatures 1 and 2, which also Salim happened to also point out, is one chapter on Charlie Mingus and another one called Coney Island Killing Fields. In Night Creatures 1, the Sheikh, with 2 jazz musician friends, Charlie Mingus and Chico Hamilton, crawl the streets of New York to find a late-night meal on New Year's Eve. The work is a character study of the three, as Haroon, Chico, and Charlie oscillate between whimsy and anger in their pursuit. Haroon details the way in which each of them have grown into their careers as jazz musicians, and the travails which have produced their unique personalities. Take, for instance, Charlie's response to the discussion with Chico over who would pay for Fats Waller's, another famous jazz musician's, tombstone. Quote, "This was indeed a delicate moment. Mingus had quite a long reputation for his hair-trigger anger and his flights of fantasy, which often manifested in his compositions and his experimental approach on the bandstand. In all fairness to Mingus, his anger was coupled with a long history of being manipulated by the record companies and booking agents, and the fact that the 1960s through the early 1970s, America was caught up in the raging flames of civil rights activism. This journey across New York brought out not only the immediate qualities of the individuals, but a history which each was still actively participating in. In this moment, the incident could be seen as an unremarkable tension brought out by a passing of a friend. But the shared systematic oppression and individual experiences of its manifestation express themselves in the tension of that minuscule journey. True travel is almost paradoxical to the conceit which travel writing relies on. Travel writing is the hope of the exotic, where the familiar becomes unfamiliar and can be seen again for the first time. It is the hope of the truly novel experience and the possibility of life-changing revelations. It is the hope of escape with the comforting promise of return. Travel, on the other hand, is mundane, an empty space filled with emotions and musings. It is where characters are revealed, not made. It is these moments of contemplation which the Sheikh rests on. His recollections reveal not only his subject's traits, but his own reflexive quality. Charlie Mingus, the titular character of the chapter, fulfills the goals of the group. Ending up in Chinatown, Mingus calls upon a friend, well past shop closing, to have a she-crab soup. The ending is nearly a parody of the exotic sights which Western travel writing often seeks out. In part of town where they are racially and culturally distinct, they find a friend. The group's partaking in a cultural dish is not based on its exceptionalism and difference, but the base need to satisfy their hunger. The fulfillment of the journey is unremarkable and expected, while the travel gives space to explore the deeper journeys each character is on. Night Creatures 2, Coney Island Killing Fields, sees Sheikh Haroon meet a friend at Coney Island at night. The name Killing Fields are because of the sand beaches of the island, where at night, sweeping and harvesting machines would roll up and down constantly, discouraging homeless camps from developing, and when necessary, eviscerating any body which got in the way. The confusion of the sights, sounds, and people that the pair encountered on that late night are starkly juxtaposed by the expectation of carnival-like imagery Coney Island immediately conjures up to the reader. The Sheikh's night journey revealed to him a new facet of the truths of human experience, lifting up just one of the societal oppression's many veils. Yet even in the totality of systematic atrocity, Haroon could find peace in the ominous silence and encroaching repetition. Quote, "The ride to Coney Island was always an adventure. It was certain that you would see some interesting characters abroad. However, this night the car was nearly empty all the way to the beach. However, the windows provided quite a lot to see of the Brooklyn skyline and the near endless silhouettes of television antennas, water towers, and chimneys. Every now and then you can make out a flight of pigeons circling the roofs where they lived in well-kept coops somewhere out in the Brooklyn darkness. The mundanity of travel brings out the highest emotions and the quietest pieces." While this panel presentation has limited my time to wax poetic on my favorite aspects of Hajj Haroon's writings, in a vain attempt to do his work justice, I would be remiss not to return to the chapter, The Flow of Barakah. From the title alone, the Sheikh recognizes the temporal and spatial dependencies, and also limits on which his journey relies on. As he was filled, so will he fill others with Barakah. The chapter primarily takes place during his childhood, detailing his time with a family friend, a Somali Muslim named Musa. It was through Musa that Sheikh would first begin to be exposed to Islamic principles of charity and humility, which he often returns to as adab, ironically enough, the same Arabic word for literature. Though Haroon, known as John at the time, did not know it and would be unable to recognize it until years later, his spiritual journey began the day he met Musa. His time with Musa was filled with the experiences he could not contextualize in the moment, showing the power of the medium of memoir. Memoir's function as a text of memory and recollection, not bounded by time or space, allows Sheikh Haroon to explore the unintended consequences and the unforeseen destinations of his travels. Musa, a family friend, would join for dinner, yet in the height of the Depression, he would bring along a bag of vegetables to ensure the family had enough to eat. Cooking together with Sheikh Haroon's mother, he would ensure the food was prepared in a halal manner, and upon serving the meal, would sincerely decline any offer of food. Sheikh Haroon admits he thought his mother's cooking must not have sat well with Musa, but in hindsight realized he was simply ensuring the family had the food they needed and would voluntarily leave so as not to make a scene. The patterns of adab and spirituality Musa embodied would become an unconscious initiation down the path of Islam. Sheikh Haroon most fondly remembers their lessons together when Musa would take him on a walk, or would take him on walks, and the Sheikh would help gather and resend Musa's mail. Their time together would harbor warm sentiments towards the Islamic faith, and which would continue to grow throughout his lifetime. Not into a conversion, but into a fruition, as Salim was detailing. The Sheikh admits he did not fully realize the impact of Musa on him until much later, in the African quarter of Brooklyn. Meeting at a coffee shop, he discussed life with Hassan Drapaliz, the former coordinator of the Somali resistance movement at the time. When asking about his old Somali friend Musa, the two began to piece together that those envelopes that Sheikh had helped resend were fundraising letters for the resistance movement. Musa had been the agent in Boston who would funnel their US-based finances to the primary office in Britain, and Sheikh Haroon had been their addressers. Without his knowledge, Sheikh had facilitated a transnational resistance movement and enjoyed a cultural and religious continuum which would guide him throughout his life. Musa was the Sheikh's first taste of barakah, enabled through the global connectivity. And in his own words, quote, "Through Mr. Musa, I received a look into the panorama of the world, its peoples, and its cultures." End quote. The seemingly minor incident was just the earliest aspect of the Sheikh's interaction with the global Islamic and Black experience. The Sheikh would travel across several continents, sharing religious, musical, and cultural experiences. But through his travels, the Sheikh recognized the global paradigm of oppression wherever he went. Quote, many years later, after having traveled to Soweto in South Africa, I was amazed at how familiar the streets of Soweto were to the streets of Roxbury, particularly the streets around Ambrose and Orchard Park. End quote. An intersectionality of oppression would become increasingly present in the Sheikh's life. For every social connectivity his confluence of identities had produced, the true scale of global atrocities was also revealed. Travel produces this ability to share and separate in equal measure. The increase of knowledge is met with an increase in sorrow. The increase of experiencing human kindness provides an increase in the exchange of barakah. The Sheikh's ability to travel speaks to the shared experience of hospitality. Quote, "In my travels, I've learned to expect nothing and become the recipient of everything that could be classified as miraculous. Let whatever is to happen, happen. Destiny writes its own script. It doesn't need any prompting from us, so sit back and enjoy the ride. The guest is many times the captive of the moment. And when you tread on sacred ground, you do yourself an injustice if you disconnect the possibility of the miraculous." End quote. Returning to the idea of identity as currency and a paradigm of mobility, as based on the expression of agency, the Sheikh allows us to move beyond some of these frameworks. As we have been discussing over the past 24 hours, the descriptive relationship of agency and identity of Black Muslims in America has a fraught history and a continued muddied present. Haroon begs us not to only be aware of the embodied experience in the present, but its continuity with the past, which identities can bring one into union with. The synthesis of his identities as musician, Black, and Muslim allows Sheikh Haroon to give transcendent quality to travel itself. His writing is inherently Islamic travel writing, but as a writer, Sheikh Hajj Haroon is singular. While Islam provides an understanding which moves beyond the necessity for individual agency and provides a holistic framework for radical healing, Sheikh Haroon's insistence on incorporating his experiences as a Black jazz musician preserves the individual spirit and possibility of novel forms of agency, which Sheikh Haroon discusses in his memoir. Community history creeps into both the marginal and monumental moments of travel in all our lives. As such, we must recognize that Sheikh's memoir does not present the events as they happened, but as he remembered and as he felt them. The writing and the experience exists for both us, the reader, and Sheikh Haroon in an abstracted state. It is in the state that each chapter is able to transcend the mere physical experience of the moment to achieve both isolated symbolic meaning and their potential in the composite of Sheikh's life. That meaning, however, is up to interpretation or discovery, depending on your preference. To quote the Sheikh himself, "For those who may be asking what the moral of this story is, I ask them to search their own consciousness and not be afraid to use their imagination." Thank you.